Hello, everybody. Nice to see you all. Nice to see so many faces. I would like to start with a land acknowledgement as well. So I'm zooming in from the traditional territories of the Lekwungen speaking peoples, the Songhees and Esquimalt nations, and very grateful to be on this land. And a couple of things that I'm working on to learn more about it so that I can take better care of the land is to learn about what's around me. So I've been given this assignment from a couple of my professors at UVic where I've tried to find out the history of the land. So I live near the Colquitts River Trail. So looking at the history before settler contact, before colonization, which is quite difficult to find, which tells us a lot right there, and then after. And it just helps you to be more rooted, I think, in the land. And I'll also share a couple more math ones because those of you who know me know that I am a super math geek. So I was attending a webinar last week, and Dr. Florence Glanfield asked the question, what math can the land teach us? And I've been wondering about that since then. So it's something I continue to think about. And another way of saying it might be, what can we learn on and from the land? And we can take math outside, and I'm going to share with you a couple of examples about that. So I'm just going to share my screen. Can you just give me a thumbs up if you can see? Awesome, great. And basically, I'm going to be reiterating some of the ideas that Leighton talked about, and just in the context of math specifically. So this is the overall sequence that we're going to run through pretty quickly, but I'd like you to play along. There'll be some sections where you can join in on the chat. So I've been teaching math for almost 20 years. And when I first started teaching, I taught totally procedurally because it was all I knew. And I used to just teach Pythagorean's theorem as a squared plus b squared equals c squared. And then we just, plugged in some numbers and came out with some answers, and that was about it. So then I started changing and making it more conceptual, more visual, and try to connect to stories. So up until this year, I have been, I use the story, What's Your Angle, Pythagoras, as a hook. It connects the students to, it gets them a little bit more interest maybe in what is this theorem and how it works. It also allows them to discover it. Currently, I'm co-teaching remotely in Angoon, Alaska, with a group of Tlingit students, and they have a really interesting little island. Angoon is. It's a very dangerous place to try to boat into and out of, and it's the only way to get there. And so the way their systems and ramps and the way the tides work is something that is very important to the whole community. So we started by looking at their boat ramp, which you can see an image of, and then we found the simulation, which was part of a 3-act task by Dan Mayer. I put the link down there for you, where they could start to estimate different ramps. And then we talked about angle of inclination. So we really started this several weeks ago, just using estimating and trying to understand the different intricacies of the boat ramp. In order to be able to access Pythagorean's theorem, students need to have some previous knowledge. So one thing about these students, we've done a few one-on-one assessments with them so far, and not a lot of fact fluency, but a lot of really great math thinking is what we could see. But I know a lot of teachers might look at the results we got and they wouldn't think that they could even access something like these concepts because, kids might not know their times tables and things like that. So this was the prompt I gave them recently, which was, what do we notice as a group and what are we wondering? So it was really interesting because some kids went directly to the numbers and they started talking about the patterns that they saw within the numbers. And then other kids talked about the visuals and the fact that they saw the squares, but even how they saw the squares growing was completely different. So it was a really neat exercise to hear how they all viewed it completely differently. And so then the prompt after we noticed and we wondered was, what do you think the next 3 terms are, or the next 3 images are in this pattern? And then we asked the students to create those and explain their thinking. And this is also where we wanted to make sure that we had the vocabulary ready for our students. And so this is whether you're teaching in English or French, having a word wall with simple images. So, looking at squaring and square rooting, there's a visual way to understand those. The square of a number is the area of the square. Like a square number is called a square number because it makes a square. And that sounds super obvious. I did not know that until like, I don't know, 10 years into my teaching. So, and then the square root is our side length. So a lot of our students don't work in this symbolic level very well yet. And as soon as we can root in with practical, you know, actual pictures for them, or better yet, manipulatives. I will tell you, Anguna's had a couple of COVID outbreaks. So right now, all of our students are working from home and all of them only have a phone. There's no computer, they don't have the bandwidth. So we are doing this with like, you know, the best way we can, but I'm going to show you how we've had to kind of adjust what we're doing to make sure that their needs are being met. And so just giving them this information so that they can have these images for themselves when they're doing the work. So what we started was we just gave them some triangles like these, and we asked, can you see a relationship? Like if we were trying to find a relationship between those three sides of the triangle, what can you do? So most kids, and the reason I start here is actually, it's like a preemptive move because many of them want to just add the two shorter lengths to make the longer length. So I really wanted to highlight right off the bat that that does not work. And you know, some of the ideas that came out, one student actually did notice that the hypotenuse was the longest side for each of the triangles. And we have continued to revisit that word. I do have like 2 math jokes in my arsenal, which is sad because I am a math super geek. So I should have more, but my math joke is, what do you call a boiling kettle on the top of Mount Everest? A hypotenuse.
Oh.
So that's, I'm the only one that ever finds that funny. But I do share that with them because sometimes that just helps them remember the name of it. So then we, you know, we looked, are there any other patterns? There wasn't much for us to see. We were all a bit stumped. This next section here is one that normally I have the students doing this. So we give them grid paper and we ask them to build any right triangle they want, as long as it can fit on the paper. And then we ask them to draw these areas. I will tell you, they have a very hard time drawing the area of the square that comes off the hypotenuse, but that's a really good activity for them to do that anyways, like in terms of geometric drawing. So the downside to using the square tiles is they're really limited to really the Pythagorean triples, where you're going to have a whole number for the hypotenuse, but you can also use that as a beginning exploration. So then what we did with our students, because they didn't have graph paper at home, like we didn't have any of our tools. So I just simply showed them this and they worked in their small groups to discuss it. What are you noticing? And of course I said, use a calculator if you need to. These kids use a calculator often, and I never have to tell them how to use it because they're doing the thinking. The calculator is only useful if you know what to put into it. And they're also getting quite good now at checking for reasonableness because they recognize that they've made errors by misusing their calculator. So this is a chance where, you know, I just said, what do you notice? And every single time I've done this, at least one student gets very excited because they figure it out and they're like, ah, the two smaller squares add up to make the bigger square. And then it's like this big like woohoo moment because they have now discovered the theorem for themselves. And that's a hugely powerful. I will name it after the first child that shares if they're feeling confident. So in our class right now, it's Isaiah. And Isaiah was very pleased with himself that he was the student that discovered the theorem. And I told him he's in good company because our friend Albert Einstein also proved this theorem at the age of 12. So the next thing we look at is a video. So once the students have all grappled with that, we watch this video multiple times and on several different days because this lesson sequence is not a one-off lesson. We've been working at it for a couple of weeks, but we only have about half an hour with the kids 3 times a week. So we have to do a lot of recapping and revisiting previous concepts. I could watch this all day long. I love this visual. I think it just clarifies what the theorem is. And by the way, this is how Pythagoras, or whoever in his commune actually discovered the theorem, which again they didn't, because I'll talk about that in a moment, they did all of their proofs visually using geometry. The whole a squared plus b squared equals c squared came hundreds of years later. So we're actually investigating this in a way that is how it was originally done. So, then we ask the kids again to talk, like, how would you explain this if you had a classmate that wasn't here? How do you say it in words? And they all have different ways of explaining it. And I don't care how they explain it, as long as they understand the concept and whatever it is that makes the most sense for them. We do introduce them to the a squared plus b squared equals c squared, and looking at that kind of more formally. What was really interesting for me is one of our students, Luke, I think it was on the third day of doing this, he had his aha moment where all of a sudden he was like, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. And he finally, that notation made sense to him. And it hadn't for the first few times that we'd looked at it. And it was neat to have him just suddenly get that. And Luke is someone who wants to be an engineer. So this whole activity was something that he really was keen on doing. He wanted to look at the ramps and the systems and see and be like an engineer. How do they go about doing the kind of problem solving that they do? And I feel necessary just to give a little bit of history, because math can be incredibly whitewashed, and it's not really very representative of the true history of math, how we often teach it. So first of all, the Babylonians, this is a concrete example, that clay palette there. They used the theorem and understood the idea of irrational numbers 1,000 years before Pythagoras was born. So we call it Pythagorean theorem, but it certainly doesn't belong to him alone. And also Pythagoras himself, we don't know a lot about his life. A lot of it is fiction, and there's a lot of mysticism, like it's reported he could teleport and all sorts of other really interesting things. But he spent 13 years studying mathematics in Egypt. So again, that knowledge was actually brought to him, not by Europeans, but by folks in Egypt. He did form a school that was kind of a cross between a religious cult and a school. Their religion was really around science and mathematics. There's lots of really interesting things about it. Don't have time to get into it. I've given you a couple of links there. I usually spend quite a bit of time with the students telling them the story about the Pythagoreans, because it's such a bizarre story, the things that people assume that are the things that we think we know about them. But bring the story, bring the history of math in. There's humans that have created all of this, and it's often we attribute a lot of our mathematics to the Greeks, but there's people that have been using that math all around the world in different ways long before they came about. So at this point, I introduced the learning goals. I deliberately didn't start with them because I wanted them to discover the theorem, and I didn't want to give that away. So at some point, though, we want to let them know that this is a relationship. We want them to understand that relationship. However they come to understand it is fine, and be able to use that theorem to solve problems. But we also want them to be able to explain it. So that's why I did the goals a little bit later on. I know traditionally we usually start our lesson with them, but sometimes you want to hold back because it allows for that chance of discovery. So once, different kids need different amounts of, support and scaffolding. So in a regular classroom, what I've often done with this is we do a few questions with our whiteboard. So they'll show me so I can see who's getting it, who's not. When the vast majority have a good understanding, I'll send them into their collaborative learning groups or partners. I know that makes it difficult with COVID. Or I'll also sit with some and I'll say, I'm going to keep working through some worked examples together. You can stay here and do that with me, or you can go off and do some independent practice. Because we know some kids, we don't want to hold them back when they're ready to really challenge themselves, but we also want to make sure that we're providing enough scaffolding for the students so that they can access it. We've had to do it as a whole group with the Angoon kids, but we've just worked through it step by step. But each student does their own bit, and they use their camera to show us what they're doing. So we're able to interact and see where they're at. what I love too here when we offer practice is give them choice and give them variety. It doesn't have to be page 132 from your textbook. The marine ramp that I gave you, when you click the button, it gives you all sorts of different heights and lengths. So the students, what they were doing was using Pythagorean's theorem to solve, and then they would plunk it into the simulator and see if they were right or not. So it was fun for them. It actually showed them a lot about rounding numbers, because if they rounded down, the ramp falls into the water in the simulator. So that was a great way for them to get their, get the feedback they need. Sometimes they can just draw their own right triangles. There's nothing to say that they can't make up their own questions and solve. And that one's really great, especially when you give students that choice with grid paper for those students that, might just need smaller numbers and to stick with more, just easier to work with numbers. And then you're going to have some that want to do things with decimals and fractions. Great. Fill your boots. I also have done where I've asked students to go around the classroom and they use a ruler or measuring tape, and they'll find right angles, and then they'll create their own triangles. And that again is those students that want to practice those other skills as well. So lots of options there. Throughout this whole process, at the end of, or towards the end of every lesson within this lesson sequence, I'm asking them for their reflection. What's your level of understanding right now? A 1, and I do it quietly so they're not broadcasting to everyone. A 1 is not yet there. A 2 is kind of there, but I'm definitely need a lot of support. 3 is I'm feeling pretty confident. And a 4 is I feel so confident about this, I could be mentoring or helping someone else. I like to ask them what they're finding the most challenging about using or understanding the relationship, and then having them set goals. One usually is for how they are working together in their group, and the second might be more of an individual learning goal. And a good use of a multiple choice question is for formative assessment in math. Give them a question like this and they can just show you a 1, 2, 3, 4. You don't need any tech, just using fingers, and it gives you a good read on the class. That's if you don't have those individual whiteboards. So for the transforming, as we're wrapping up here, because I know I'm out of time, our Angoon students actually went out and did field work. So they went out and measured the boat ramp. They measured the tides. They looked at the tidal charts. A lot of them have fishermen in their families, so they were talking with them about how they measure the tides, and then they were trying to figure out the gap and looking at their actual ramp in their community. In the storybook, we can revisit. It gives us a nice chance to practice one of the problems in the book there, where Pythagoras is wanting to go from Samos to Crete in the quickest possible way. So they have to solve for that. These I just pulled from the Math Makes Sense 8 textbook. They're all great questions because they require students to do more than just solve the procedure. And it gives you a range of extension, like number 16 incorporates lots of other concepts. And number 12 is that assessment focus. I love this question. There's multiple right answers, and it just shows you a whole lot more what they know. Again, we reflect. These are more reflection questions. I love that second one. What mistakes happened in class that helped to clarify your understanding? It doesn't have to be a mistake they made, but those mistakes are valuable for our learning in mathematics. And finally, I've given this for about 10 years, and I get more information from this writing exercise than I have ever from a paper and pencil test where they're just doing the procedures. It just gives you so much information about what they do and don't yet know. So I know Leighton's gonna share a slide to finish us off. So a couple of things, if we had a little bit more time, we'd ask you to, actually, I am gonna ask you to just type this into the chat. What are some takeaways? So, these are suggestions that we hope to highlight today, the idea of your reflections and your formative assessment throughout, so that you know where your students are at and what their interests and their needs are. Because again, we're tailoring everything. So when I taught this to the Angoon learners, it was a different process than I had before, partly because they were at home with their phones, and partly because they didn't have some of the math skills that I thought even before were necessary to do this. And I will tell you, every single one of them has been successful. They have understood all these concepts and have shown mastery. So it also is a really nice reminder that don't underestimate, like just because your students might, use their fingers to add, or they don't know any of their times tables, doesn't mean that they cannot be successful in accessing these other math concepts. And please use those multiple modalities, the videos, gestures. Some kids were showing us their understanding by gestures, right? They were saying, well, the two smaller boxes together make the big box. Gestures are hugely important in math. And I will stop there. Thank you. Back to you, Leighton. Phew, that was fast.
So friends and colleagues, thank you for finding some time in your incredibly full lives to be in community. Thanks for celebrating the work that you're already doing by making connections. And we hope that you'll just take what you're doing a little further in terms of thinking about responsive teaching as this practice that is not only what our kids deserve, but probably what will be also more fulfilling for us as educators. When we teach our kids as who they are and support them to grow from where they are, not only is the learning better, but the teaching is more satisfying. So thanks for coming together online. Our next session, Shelley Moore is our guest. So Shelley will join us and she'll be talking about designing for diversity and deeper learning. Today we focused on chapter 3 from It's All About Thinking in the Middle Years. And that day we'll focus on chapter 4 for those of you who are reading along. No reading required, but there you go. Love you in a professional way. Thank you, Nikki. Come on, Nikki. And also thank you to SD61 for hosting this and making this available to the province and beyond. Take good care.